Hello, this is Mike Smith. Welcome back to part 2 of my texturing tutorial in Maya. In this part, we'll have a look at making the most out of your texture file when we render it, and also how to create and apply a bump map. So first of all, double check your project folder is set. Go back to File, Set Project, navigate to your project folder and click on Set. It's a good idea to get into the habit of doing that every time, especially if you're in an environment with shared computers. So now if we look at our UV texture editor, you can see I've completed the texturing on all the faces of my UV map, and if we have a look at our 3D object, that's the result we've got. I've added a floor and also a physical sun and sky lighting system to this, just so you can actually see the render we get. Now, the first render you'll see looks quite low quality, it's quite blurry. That's because Maya actually creates a default filter, and we can adjust these filters. Sometimes they work brilliantly, other times they don't. And we can get to them by selecting our object, go back to your attribute editor and navigate all the way to the right where you'll find your material tab. If you remember from part 1, we called it brick texture 1. And then if we look down in common material attributes, have a look at color, it's spelt the American way without the U, and bump mapping. And you'll notice to the right of those there's some different icons. Those icons are the output connection icon, because it's actually got a file attached. If I click on the output connection of color, we get some more attributes, and in here you can actually access your different filter types. There's a few to play around with, but if you turn that off, you'll find you get a much crisper looking texture, and it works quite well for things like bricks. If we re-render that now, you'll see the results. So there you go, we've got a much clearer looking texture. It's got more clarity, a little bit more contrast, and now we want to create a bump map to put a bit more detail into this again. So if you go back to your project folder, go back to your source images folder and reopen that PSD file. Here we go, so that's how far I got with my texturing. And if we look at our layers palette, you'll notice there's a few more layers than we had in part 1. That's just because I've finished texturing this. Each layer is actually titled, so I know which piece is which. And now we want to select all of these layers that have a texture. So just select the first one, hold shift and select the bottom one. We don't want to select the grey layer 1 or the folder. And we now want to duplicate these and put them inside our .bump folder. So to duplicate, we can either go up to Layer, Duplicate Layers, or if you're on a Mac, Command and J, or a PC, Control and J. Once they're duplicated, while they're still selected, we can just move those up into our .bump folder. Turn the visibility on the folder now, because we want to actually see what we're doing on this one. And now we need to merge these down into one layer. And we can do that by going back to Layer. And while they're still selected, merge layers. And that's merged down into one. And we're going to title that, double click on it, and I'm just going to call it Bump Map. And what we need to do now is work in black and white. For an effective bump map, we just want a small amount of black, but mostly white. And there's several different ways to actually turn a layer into black and white. This time I'll just go to Image, Adjustments, and then black and white. Some more options will come up. We can leave those on their default value. Click on OK. And for a bump map to work, like I said, it's got to be mostly white with just a small amount of black. And the black areas will look like they're almost indented or embossed into the texture itself. So we want things like this crack to stand out quite a lot. And to increase the white, you could increase the contrast, but that will increase the black as well. So we want to look at our levels. If we go up to Image, Adjustments and Levels, we get our histogram here. Now that's our graph from black through our midtones and to white. If I move this white slider here up to the left, we can increase the white quite a bit. And you don't want to go too far where there's just a tiny amount of black, and you don't want to leave it where there's loads of grey either. You need it somewhere in the middle, and you'll need to really experiment with this to get it right. Normally I'd put in a bit more white, but I'll leave it there just so it's exaggerated for you, so you can see this effect when it's rendered. Click on OK, and now we can save this. It doesn't matter that we can no longer see our texture layers, it's just because they're below this bump layer. Maya will still recognize it, it will still read it, so we can just save it as it is. So just go back to File, Save. Don't save as or change the name. Go back into Maya, and we need to go back to our UV texture editor, and we need to update that PSD network. So go to Image, Update PSD network, and then like we did with the filter on the main texture file, we can have a look at that. So select your object, go to the output connections next to bump mapping, and you'll need to really experiment with these filters quite a lot with a bump map. Sometimes the default quadratic filter works. I find most of the time with a brick wall or anything like rocks and stones, if you leave it off, it works best. I'll show you quadratic first of all. So if I render that as it is, there you go. So with the quadratic filter, it loses its sharpness, and it's bumped a bit too much. It looks almost cartoon-like. So let's try turning that filter off and then re-rendering this again. There we go. So that's a much better result. If we have a look at some of these edges now, it looks less like a flat texture. It almost looks like I've extruded some of these parts, some of the bricks. You can adjust it further. It's worth spending some time to actually get the settings and the attributes correct, and just make a note of them, screenshot them, write it down, keep it somewhere safe. Okay, so keep practicing it, you will get much quicker at texturing, and try and learn something new.